Hi, everybody, and thanks for attending today's webinar, Continuous Compliance in a Financial Services Environment, How to Automate Compliance in Highly Regulated Environments. My name is Erin, and I'm on the marketing team at Chef, and I am happy to introduce today's speakers on this webinar as Chris Medina, Solutions Architect Lead, and Alan Baptista, Product Marketing Director here at Chef. Before I turn it over to these two, I have a couple housekeeping items to cover. If you have any questions, you can submit them in the Q&A section at any time, and they will be answered at the end of the presentation. Definitely feel free to submit them throughout the presentation, unless one of these guys wants to address any pertinent questions that come up during the presentation. They might do that as well. For the best viewing experience, we recommend closing any additional programs or browser sessions running in the background, as webinars are bandwidth intensive. And finally, as always, this webinar is being recorded and an on-demand version of the presentation will be available by tomorrow. So for those of you just joining, welcome to today's presentation, Continuous Compliance in a Financial Services Environment, How to Automate Compliance in Highly Regulated Environments. Let's go ahead and get started. Alan, over to you.
Thank you, Erin. Hi, everyone. My name is Alan Baptista. I'm the Product Marketing Manager for Chef Compliance and for Chef Desktop here at Chef, a little over 2 years. And we'll be talking to you about continuous compliance in a regulatory environment, more specifically financial services. And this is part of an exercise that we did, I want to say a month or so ago, where we did some invitation only events with financial institutions around the country, around the world actually, and we for both practitioners and IT decision makers, and we wanted to make sure that this content is made available more broadly. So that's why we're presenting this this webinar now. And it is my honor, it's distinguished honor and pleasure to introduce you to one of our security and compliance experts in Chris Medina. Why don't you introduce yourself, Chris?
Thanks, Alan. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. My name is Chris Medina. I'm the Chief Technical Advisor for the East for Field Engineering. I do dab a little bit in security and super excited to be here with you.
Thank you, Chris. We're going to be doing a couple of things throughout this webinar. We're going to be covering some of the background on issues in these highly regulated environments in financial services. And then we're going to kind of talk to you about how we envision compliance as code as being the way you can automate the solution and bring a clearer way and a more efficient way to manage your compliance status. So this is a survey that BDO did recently, and a few of the findings there that I think are most interesting to highlight. And the BDO Financial Services Digital Transformation Survey had a series of questions to 3 key elements in financial services. It was financial institutions, those are mostly the banks and credit unions, insurance companies, and asset management as the 3 pillars in those organizations. And they were asking mostly about how digital transformation occurs, what are some of the pitfalls, what are some of the areas of concern in these organizations' efforts around their digital transformation journey. When asked what are their top 3 priorities for the next 12 to 18 months, different organizations responded differently. Financial institutions mostly focused on improving the customer experience, modernizing their IT infrastructure, continuing to modernize, I would say, and then increasing their operational efficiency. Some key elements. What differs in terms of the insurance and asset management when asked the same question was that they included bolstering cybersecurity in those top 3 responses. So it's an interesting aspect that why didn't the financial institutions really cover those that cybersecurity aspect? Well, I would think we believe that the fact is because financial institutions have been dealing with cybersecurity enhancements longer than insurance and asset management companies. When they were asked about top digital threats, cyber attacks or privacy concerns were top of mind by 52% for financial institutions, 43% in insurance companies, and 43% in asset management companies had cybersecurity as a top digital threat. So considerable, mostly nearly half of respondents had cybersecurity as a major concern. And then they were asked about how digital initiatives, what were their digital initiatives in risk management and compliance. 68% of the financial institutions had some level of risk management and compliance effort ongoing. Insurance had only 38%, and asset management even less, only 28% of those said that they had some level of digital initiatives around risk management and compliance. So Chris, you've been out there talking, security and compliance for a while. How do these figures relate to what you're seeing out there in the field?
So I'd say they're nearly perfectly aligned. What's interesting about these numbers, Alan, is that from a financial institution standpoint, you're really looking at regulatory compliance, right? They are going to have to be audited and aligned to particular types of standards that are beholden by the federal government and some other agencies in terms of being compliant with their security measures. Whereas insurance and asset management groups are not necessarily held, to those strengths, and you see more their percentage lean more towards tax and privacy. These numbers aren't surprising, right? If you have valuable financial information, you're really taking a look at, the environment as a whole, whereas risk management and compliance can keep you assured of where you are in terms of security softness. But then rather you want to pay more attention to cyber attacks and cyber risks for individuals. So understanding those two being different parts of the security spectrum and how they align or marry up together to build a great security practice, these numbers line up perfectly.
And I think one important aspect is overall, when we go into the solution, this is not something that is exclusive for financial services. It's just that this webinar we're presenting is more specifically to the financial services industry, but it also applies to healthcare. It also applies to government institutions, to retails, PCI, DSA. We'll show you some of the customer examples that they're not always exclusively for financial services. So if you're from a regulatory environment, this also applies to you. But so one thing I think the organizations are really trying to do is to avoid making headlines like these. And these involve global major financial services institutions for impacts of how data breaches impacted their organizations, fines that they're having for lack of a cybersecurity program. And we don't want our customers, and no organization really wants to have these plastered all over the internet and in major news, organizations. So is this a major concern, or am I just, too much marketing fluff here?
No, Alan, I would say that what's interesting here is, again, going back to those two different facets of security risk, you see people trying to avoid these headlines by simply just paying out the ransom. If you're looking at security breaches from an individual aspect, from a state actor or bad actor aspect, and paying out these things, companies have been just paying that out because large in part, their enterprises are so big, they don't want to make the investment and alignment, and they'll just simply pay it out, then go back to figuring out how they can fill in those gaps for compliance and security softness. So yeah, it's not out of the ordinary to see this. Even companies anticipating that, okay, we have some certain weakness in certain areas. Let's set parts of money aside to be able to handle this should it occur. That's a very sad state to be in. But again, security is oftentimes seen as insurance. That you very rarely see those returns until something like this happens. So those people who are making those investments in that are much better off in the long run.
Yes, and not if all these issues and concerns wasn't a factor in everybody's minds, then we have a new reality of a post-COVID pandemic world where work from home is a new reality and will continue to be for the short term, and in many instances, even in the longer term basis, many organizations are already considering how this work from home environment is going to continue. Well, that doesn't reduce, it actually increases the threat vectors that organizations have to deal with, especially with now having a larger number of devices that are out and available, and how those impact the security and compliance of the organization. This is a survey that ESG, the Enterprise Strategy Group, did in June this year, where some of the key findings we have highlighted here, where over a quarter of knowledge workers are now using a new computing device, a laptop, a desktop at home, or bring your own device as a result of COVID-19 work from home mandates. So that's an incredible increase in the number of devices that are out there. And then when asked about their likely spend due to COVID-19, organizations said that 40% of their spend will include cybersecurity, and 35% include that remote work. So it's really an expensive proposition to have securing those remote workers. When asked, 36% have experienced an increased volume of cybersecurity vulnerabilities resulting from that work, from that remote work, so that increased threat vector. And nearly half of the organizations really report an increase in the cyber attacks. So the attackers aren't sleeping and aren't, waiting on their laurels. They're really taking advantage of this. And I think it's a key for organizations to understand that the proliferation of devices can be seen as a threat and needs to be addressed accordingly. Thoughts there, Chris?
Yeah, Alan, what's interesting about this is take into consideration this is 3 months after the pandemic started, right? And so the big rush in March was more, hey, I have budgeted nearly, and it can be depending on the organization, probably about 30 to even half of my workforce being remote or needing the accessibility remotely. Now I've got this pandemic. I'm going to put mandated operations in place where now I have to figure out how am I going to enable my workforce from 100% capacity? I didn't budget that out before, and get that out to each one of my folks to still remain productive for the corporation. Once they did that, then turning around in June, to the like of all hackers out there, they're like, okay, they've just increased their edge product twofold. So now I've got much more opportunity to be able to infiltrate. I get into the endpoint, they VPN back in. Now I've got access to the enterprise. So now cybersecurity at this point, 3 months later, is spiked, and they're understanding, hey, I've got a lot of softness in what we're doing. I've got a lot of softness in patchwork for laptops and other mobile devices, and I've got to figure that out in a hurry because it wasn't such a big security risk 3 months prior.
And if that wasn't enough, then the financial services really has this comprehensive set of regulations that they not only have to comply with, but have to live by. GDPR as a data protection, the new California Data Protection Act, as well, the PCI DSS if you're dealing with credit card processing. How are these regulations seen, the FFIEC for that matter, but how are these regulations seen, Chris, by the financial services organizations, and how much time and effort is really spent around the effort to remain compliant to these regulations?
That's a great question, Alan. So you take a look at NIST standards, CIS standards, all of these things that the financial services are held obligatory to is very fluid, right? You've got to be able to modulate, the particular types of policies and the security measures that you have in place, the types of defenses and layering that you put in terms of the sensitive data. And then you have to constantly, as a corporation, or an agency, figure out, hey, this particular data is going to be a little bit more sensitive in that. And then it comes down to financials. So when it comes to putting these things in place, they're constantly changing and creating more work for the security teams. And then again, is it about, being able to handle these ad hoc audits and giving them the visibility to ensure that, yea, verily, we are in a secure environment, or we can meet those security standards? Or is it about, hey, do I want to concentrate my workforce on the gateway and all the people who are being creative and trying to hack into my front end, or try to do infiltration, or stop the data leakage? It's just a very complex environment. So these processes are just a template for what most corporations, especially financial corporations, are putting in place to keep all that data and your information safe.
And you mentioned kind of the balancing act, and that kind of resonates with what we talk about, that there's a delicate balance, there's really a need for balance between speed and security. Typically, you have to weigh those kind of in opposite directions, right? You can have speed, but then your security is decreased, or you have a slower rollout, but then your security is usually time consuming. But there's an alternative too. And this is what we're going to be talking about. And Gartner kind of validates that in this quote, where they talk about the balance for speed and risk we're able to do it by leveraging automation and implementing what we call compliance as code. So this concept of codifying your compliance, making it into profiles, and which can be automated and inserted into a pipeline process. And we're going to go into that in a little more detail in the future. But I think it just resonated so much with me when Gartner finally, is accepting this compliance as code as a true valid process. How do you see this delicate balancing happening out there with financial services companies?
I'll say it's first and foremost. Bringing this into the environment and understanding the operation is absolutely what these institutions are looking at as a baseline. What's missing here, though, Alan, I'd say from the field is, it's arguable, but most agencies and corporations will argue that price is probably the third leg in this stool, where they have to constantly measure, who, what, when, and where, and how they're going to build those defenses in there. And price does play a big part in, what they're able to put in place to ensure that security. But compliance is code. Anybody who's looking into right now understanding DevSecOps, or the operation as a whole, and how they can save money, increase their time to value in terms of looking at TTPs and IOCs, in eliminating the risk in their environment. Compliance as code is a big term right now that everybody's looking at very hard, and I'm super excited to be talking about it with you guys today.
So why do we see that? That hindrance to speed and agility? And one way we look at it, it may be because of the way traditional approaches have typically, left security and compliance reviews and checks or testing as a last step before everything is put into production. And then this inherently, I think, causes a number of problem, right? After dev and ops are done with the software environments, they'll pass along to the security people for their review process, as this is someone late step in the process overall.
I'm sorry, Alan. Yeah, as a SOC lead, I can tell you, and I'm sorry, just pulls a trigger. Every time development would send something or try to send something into operations, we were always seen as the bad guys, right? We're just the people who are keeping us from, making our schedule on time or delivering in a proper time limit. But security is a big thing now, so being able to build that in is a huge piece to this chain.
Right, and those security reviews that happen are manual, they're slow, they're time consuming. Typically, we have a proposition that changes that a little bit, but they rely on these scanning tools that generate this massive amount of data that they essentially just hand it off to the development team again. It's like, okay, go fix it, right? Without much clarification and explanation. So they may catch problems too late in the development process to really economically fix. So each stage in the process, it's a tenfold cost of expense. We talk about shifting security and compliance left in this process as part of what we see as compliance as code. So that's part of the reason we advocate for this compliance as code process. And it's also very hard to manage, exceptions to the overall process because it's a very truncated, very linear process. Any thoughts here?
Yeah, no, this is, you hit it spot on, right? Once I get it from a security aspect, I don't know what happened in the development or making the new feature functionality. So I've got to tear this whole thing back apart, figure out where I think weaknesses or ensure that the security is built into it. And you're absolutely right. I typically will generate a report. It will take me a long time because I wasn't involved in the process. Once I finally get it back to their frustration, I'm like, you need to fix these things. Here you go. And then they have to rebuild all of that stuff, recompile, and then push it back out. I'll have to reevaluate it before it'll ever get to production.
And we talked about audits too, and this is kind of an interesting graph that kind of exemplifies to me that even though we're doing the audits, there's still a struggle to remain compliant. And an interesting aspect here is that generally the assumed level of compliance is that it's very linear, right? And with the periodic checks that are done throughout time to validate the consistent level of compliance. But what really happens in reality is that these audits and assessments that are done is that you don't know what actual level of compliance really is, because you can only know really at that level, the level of compliance at that point in time and as often as it is checked. So if you have a quarterly assessment, it's not linear, right? You have this deeps, valleys, and troughs that kind of lower the actual reality because new elements are being introduced into the system as it should be. And an excluded, very locked down system. You're adding new variables to it, which increase the possibility of non-compliance. And so I think the only way to really be able to maintain a actual continuous compliance is by doing continuous audits of these systems, or a method that allows you to remain in continuous compliance and notify you when it falls out of that compliance state. Any thoughts here on the audits?
Yeah, so as a security person, it can take me quite a long time to even complete an audit, right? So this graph here on the left are the assumptions that I would be going by, trying to understand, okay, we had this point in time where we were completely compliant and aligned to the policies that we have in place. And a couple things that happen, right? One is I've got this huge fleet of servers that I'm trying to ensure their security on. And I'm going to assume because they were built in a certain manner that they're going to be compliant. And I may not check all of them just for the sake of the schedule, right? If it takes me, 2-3 months to actually complete an audit, I may forego testing everything in a particular section of my fleet because I know they were built the same way. So I'm making an inference here. The actuality on the right in your graph there is, hey, so I've got this point in time where I'm compliant. I also have this second aspect where development is pumping in new feature functionality and updates into my tools. And the compliance level goes down. And then you see this quick spike because now I know there's a date and time where my next audit is coming, and I'm going to rush to ensure the entire fleet is compliant again. So that's what creates these dips. And if I were to have a tool that I could look at, visibly and say, hey, I can tell my fleet is reporting back that, we're in compliance or we're not, I can spend my energy and my time more wisely, and that equates to a lot of dollar savings.
And yeah, you mentioned the time consuming aspect of audits, and that's an interesting stat that we found. So on the right-hand side, you have some of the IDG survey that we did for security. We see that most companies take at least 2 months to complete a compliance and security audit. So that's a lot of time that you're spending. If you're doing it on a quarterly basis, well, you have a month left and you're gonna have to start it all over again to do another audit cycle. And even though the audits are happening, still 73% of the companies that we interviewed said that they're releasing vulnerabilities at least once a year. So why is that? Why is it so difficult to maintain that continuous secure state of the environments that you're working on? The Verizon data breach report of 2019 kind of reports that 56% of the breaches took months or longer to discover. Not only that, but they're also rely on 90% of the exploits were observed with only 9 known vulnerabilities. So it's not like it's completely new. We know the vulnerabilities. It's just getting to them and fixing them and maintaining them is really time consuming and very difficult to do. Thoughts on these stats? Does the 2 month kind of resonate with you guys?
Yeah, we see that in the field all the time. It's typically 2 months. I've seen some people, I've had customers come back and tell me it takes as long as 72 days to just deploy one particular server. So that gets to be pretty expensive if you look at time and effort that's spent on that. And it's about being productive, right? It's time to market. If I can beat my competition, to market with a new feature functionality, if security is holding me up on that, or I'm potentially in deploying some type of security breach that allows intruders to get in, I don't want to be in that environment. So having the ability to hasten securely my productivity and my product market is essential. And so 2 months is about right.
Okay, great. So we talk about the continuous compliance um, through Chef Compliance, which is our marquee product base there. And this is kind of the cycle of continuous compliance that we envision you're able to do with Chef Compliance, where you initially start, you acquire the content, the core content information, and you have a one-stop shop where it's CIS secured information, and you have this secure chain of custody that comes from CIS, the Center for Internet Security benchmarks that Chef uses and leverages those certified content, and will then use those baselines to define the baselines of what your profiles should be. And then you are able to configure waiver and remediation that are necessary and deploy those compliant desired baseline state. You are able to continuously evaluate the compliance posture that you have and apply those waivers accordingly whenever necessary. And once you detect that there is deviation from the desired state, you're able to remediate the non-compliant controls and reassure and reinsert the compliant state or refocus the system to be compliant once again. And then obviously report on the continuous compliance posture and be able to determine the differences, the deltas between the baseline and the remediated states, and track waivers accordingly and modify them and update them whenever the reason for the waiver is no more. And then the ability to have a continuous visibility of your audit status, I think by having those reports handy will help you reduce that 2 month lag and continuously feed those reports into an audit scenarios and situations. So you almost can have ad hoc audits that are a lot from months to probably down to days. How do you see continuous compliance using this chef compliance framework, Chris, out there, and some of the
So
customers that we've had?
yeah, so what I see is a lot of customers moving towards this DevSecOps um, motion. And this is really kind of the core of why. It's not just about a moment in time or having visibility to your security risk. It's about having control over the system, right? Audits have typically, very traditionally been seen as, where am I at? What's my risk? Can I report it? And understand where I need to spend time and money and energy. Now it's more of a, how much control do I have? Where am I really at risk? How fast can I respond if I do find some type of malicious activity happening at the front door, or some type of internal data leakage? How can I react to that? How fast can I react to that? It's not just about understanding where I am in terms of weakness anymore. So this is really where the concepts come from, and how organizations across the world are trying to hasten their security measures and keep everything secure.
And then we see that only through managing security as managing security and compliance as code is where you're able to really leverage the scalability, and like you mentioned, the ability to not only audit but only confirm compliance and security to these small subset of systems, but really having the ability to do it comprehensively across your entire environment, not only in a data center, but also, remember, we talked about work from home. So this is something that you can also carry from endpoint device area, where you're able to manage the compliance and security of your laptop fleet and your desktop or workstation type of scenarios as well. So it's something that it's very powerful message in terms of codifying all this. And the benefits of code and managing compliance and security as code is you have the ability to use this common language. And I don't think we talked about the common language aspect of things, but you're able to use this as a human readable code. You see that code base on the right hand side, which can be easily interpreted by a security specialist, and is conveyed to your DevOps teams and your development team just as easily, so they understand the language. But I'll not only do that, but they also have tags and where the compliance, the PCI, for instance, there, or the HIPAA or NIST, are elements that are tracked and notated to allow for complete compliance references there. So the ability to scale beyond a single system is also important. It's repeatable and reliable in a reliable way. You're able to shift from the security testing. You're able to move that shift left that we talked about. You're shifting that security testing left instead of having it at the end of the process. And you're able to really have this continuous monitor of the status of the security complaints and correct the adjustments whenever needed, when there is a drift that can be quickly and efficiently done. So you're ultimately driving security and compliance through code into this continuous compliance state, where security no longer is a burden, a barrier, but it is really an enabler of speed. And this is something that Gartner validates too, where this compliance as code, infrastructure as code, which we're well known for, and this continuous configuration automation are all valuable ways to have security and compliance within your organizations. Any thoughts here?
How impactful is this, Alan? Too many times I've gone over parts of the code and how we do our auditing. I've worked with several very well-known third-party audit organizations doing financial audits, and they were able to do it. Their big answers to me, or their big reports back to me were, hey, I can read this. It's in plain language. I can tell you what the title is and what it's looking for. I understand from a certificate of authority how it was built and how it's being applied. I can see it's a HIPAA tag. It comes from a NIST standard. This is straightforward. It is literally cut their time in half for doing the actual audit. Because what happens when, and everybody who's gone through this has said, hey, look, we just want to come in, understand, and I'm not a coder. How do you see yourself as aligned with these particular standards? What makes you say that? Let me see your report. This is the easiest, most straightforward way, and most of them are starting to move in this direction.
That is awesome, and we believe that. And there's a question here that we're going to address shortly, but after this slide. But a key piece of this compliance automation is to scan early and often in the software development lifecycle. So instead of performing the compliance scans, only during that last stage of review, we're not advocating that you shouldn't be doing that last stage of review. That is simply that you're just going to be doing it concurrently and in different stages, so that you're able to maintain the compliance state of the software that you're developing, or the code, or the infrastructure that you're throughout the process. So you're having that continuous compliance state throughout that, but having a last mile check and security review is a lot faster and a lot more efficient that way. And Gartner even validates that by the end of in a couple of years, 60% of organizations in these regulated environments will have some level of integrated compliance as code into their DevOps tool chains. We actually have this report available. If you want to take a further look into it, it is readily available on our website. Any thoughts here, Craig or Chris? And there's a question from one of our readers here as well, or one of the attendees in the Q&A. So, do you see much resistance in change from the compliance teams in adopting this compliance as code methodology? The benefits are obvious to most people, but there's a natural tendency that can sometimes be sticky to the way they have always done it. So yes, it's a change in the status quo in the way of looking at compliance. And I think this next slide kind of explains some of that differences there. So how do you see that? Is there resistance to change, and how do we address those?
Yeah, so this is a great segue, Craig. Thanks for your question. When you see the agility and what we're trying to do, there's a couple ways that we can deploy, and this is also a good slide for that. But building security into the entire process, right? Being able to check periodically whether or not you're in alignment, if you need a particular patch, if you need to build in some other module in an API, say, you want to incorporate TLS 2.0 instead of 1.5. Any of these particular examples are valid, but we are always corporations are always tending to maintain what they have, right? Because it's budgeted, number one, but number two, it's familiar, so it's easy, and anything that you're very familiar with is always going to go faster. But if you can front load it into the pipeline from this aspect, right? When we put these things together from these three particular groups and we say, hey, let's build a common language and build security policy as code, then we're able to not only be more agile in terms of the process and incorporating into how we're doing the build, even if it's raw code or let's say infrastructure deployment, we're able to take that artifact and put it into the pipeline, test what we're putting through there so it gets into that trusted artifact store. People who are familiar with this, especially from a security perspective, can see that what we're really doing is creating a secure supply chain, right? We understand where this is coming from. We have a trusted certificate of authority. We know when, where, how, and who. We've got a hash on this particular piece of code. So we know that that's the gold standard for security. And as we push it through the pipeline, we can rest assured that the fleet is going to get that update. Likewise to this, if we continue to create that gold standard and leave it available, then the fleet can just look to that policy for its update. Hey, I see I'm running 1.5 in TLS. I'll go off and I'll get 2.0 and do that installation. That can all be automated at the push of a button. It can react to the modulation in your security policy on the fly, and your speed to security alignment is going to be much faster. The extra added benefit to that is this human-free zone you create, right? How many of us are manually logging in to do these updates, or manually have to touch or do a scan or reach the box to be able to make the changes we need to come into alignment? With this particular method of doing this, only system can make adjustments to the fleet, right? Why is that so important? Because if Alan Baptista is going to log into one of my servers, rest assured, I know I'm not wasting my time sifting through all the people who are trying to touch these machines. Only system should be touching them. So I'm not wasting my time going after Alan and trying to understand what it is he's trying to do. He's probably doing something malicious. He probably shouldn't be doing something that he's trying to do. And I can investigate that with a high percentage of probability that it needs to stand correction. So that's a great question, Craig. Yeah, it's difficult, but once people get their minds wrapped around the idea of building security into the way that they deploy, they never turn back from it. It's a little bit more work on the front end, but the long-term operations and the significant ROI you see for corporations, the numbers speak for themselves there.
Very cool. I think there's another question here that we can answer in kind of the same time frame. You may have already answered it, but Eddie's asking, excuse me, Eddie's asking, does compliance happen in each stage of the CI/CD pipeline, or is it at the beginning?
So it's like in the previous slide you had there, Alan, it's built in through the process. There's a couple of methods where you can architect this. But if you can build it into the pipeline itself, where during that stage of development, and to answer Ann's question as well, you get the standard, and you can get that from DISA with NIST, you can get it from CIS. These particular standards can be built in and then modified towards your corporation's policy standards, which absolutely is almost mandatory because no one ever follows directly. But if you can build those tests into the development cycle in the pipeline, and it can be tested, right? You have a method of which, like a test kitchen of some sort, that you can actually test that part of the code with the security compliant measures and then pass it along to Q&A. They already have a report. You're speeding your process through this entire operation. Staging goes quicker. The security review comes back. It's almost just a checkbox. Because they already have all that information in front of them. They can see in plain language where everything sits in terms of compliance and alignment, and that moves that whole enterprise to production much quicker. So it can happen at any part of this. Now, just to be clear, you can build this into the pipe, or you can just deploy it into the architecture to be able to do what you've always done, right? If you've got already automation that you're toying with or you're using with other folks, there is no need to pull that stuff out. You put compliance on top of those particular pieces, and you can get a full picture of where you are in terms of alignment to that policy. And then you can actually use the current tools that you have to be able to remediate those particular pieces, or you can simply just build it into the pipeline through CI/CD. Hope that answers the questions.
And I think we didn't mention, the intent here was to talk about Chef compliance necessarily. So we didn't, or more of compliance as code as a solution. So we didn't highlight so much of the product features, but Chef compliance has an aspect where we leverage what we call Chef premium content, which is Chef has taken the heavy lift, the heavy burden of creating templated profiles, for the lack of a better term, using CIS benchmarks for different OSs and different environments, as well as the DISA STIGs standards for organizations that are doing business with financial or government organizations, but also it's extremely extensible. So if the organizations, to Chris's point, so if organizations want to, one, modify what we provide as premium content, or two, they want to have a set of enterprise specific compliance that they need to follow, or specific different compliance that we haven't covered yet, the tool is powerful enough to allow for uh, organizations to do so. Some of the common use cases that we see. Do you want to take this, Chris? I think I need a little, my voice is going hoarse here.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so in these three facets, we're looking at auditing for security purposes, right? Focusing on the continuous security assessment. We talked a little bit about that earlier, but it's just, straight up, hey, I've seen these CVEs come out. I see these vulnerabilities come out. How are we going to patch or recover from those things? What is the guidance from in terms of compliance from CIS, DISA, and stated one for the auto industry? Um, Understanding that alignment is huge, and what they say, could be the best method for being able to combat or shore up your systems and defenses for security. And then making sure that it actually works, right? Functional testing. You can come back with an audit. What I see in the field is you can come back with an audit from that particular from any particular instance, really, but you can come back with an audit with either yellow or red results that may be false positives, right? You may have a password standard that meets that compliance, right? But it may be less than due to some, other resulting security measures that you have going on, which will likely never be known. Most of the time when I talk about security, it's a little bit sensitive area because groups really don't want to give up their secret sauce, right? I have security measures in place. I don't want you to understand them because if you do, you can defeat them. But automation has really revolutionized the way we do it, right? Having the ability to go out and grab a piece of code that can come and bring me into compliance without me having to manually go in and do these changes is huge. It's really aligned with where the industry is going in terms of having AI in place, building out a machine learned environment that can go and look at certain or have certain updates from say a GitHub or some type of Git instance, where updates can be made and respond to that nearly automatically, which people can argue that that's a fairly dangerous thing, and it can be. But if you've got a good practice and you're used to doing it, as with anything, it becomes a standard. And so being able to test that on the fly is huge in terms of making sure that configuration is right and everything is going in and working as tested.
Sorry, I'm still muted. So we have a couple of customer examples here, and I think we mentioned that element of testing for the configuration status. I think this is a case where Danske Bank really was able to use to fully automate the way servers and their VMs were provisioned, and provided updates with Chef Infra, which is our configuration management tool, reducing the deployment times from days to minutes. It took less time spent this repeated manual process, and work was scaled and applied consistently with fewer diversions and the differences in the way that approaches, with fewer opportunity for configuration drift due to this human error. So that applies for both security and a compliance state. Once it's settled, you can automatically manage the configuration and remediation of any drifts that occur there. There's another case where we have Haventech out of Australia, which allowed for them to deploy the payment tokenization and their PCI solutions anywhere in the world in a matter of minutes while maintaining their PCI compliance. They automated infrastructure provisioning for Docker environments quickly and consistently, and reduced their deployment time from days into minutes with zero data loss in the 5 years that they've had this solution up and running. Any thoughts, anything in terms of customer successes? I think you have some other customer examples in mind that may have that may not be publicly known, but you can maybe refer to them as an existing customer base.
Yeah, you'd be surprised, some of the other folks that are looking and using our product actually for these particular things. You'll they've come to number one, the scalability of it. For instance, we had one customer who was doing a lot of scanning of their fleet, trying to understand the environments and getting a proper audit report back. And the security measures that they had put in layered for those particular departments prevented them from getting a proper audit, and then changes on the back end, in understanding where they were in compliance. Having the ability to put a small agent on the system and have them report just outwardly, so no scans in could be achieved, was actually more secure for them, and they could get a clear audit report back on where compliance stood. Where that's also benefited from a lot of these companies is the fact that they've increased their edge deployment. So they've deployed a number of laptops and mobile devices that are out there. They won't understand an audit of those devices until those devices check in somehow, right? Until they connect to the network. What's nice about having that agent that runs on the system is you can keep those devices secure whether they're on the network or not. They have the policy and understanding of where those policies should be. They're logging any changes that happen to that system, especially from a user. We have users who are constantly trying to install different types of software, but even if they're off the network, they're able to keep those laptops locked down. So those are some of the use cases that they had, but from the financial institutions, yeah, they love the way this is architected because they can build, for instance, in that example, they can build a laptop, put it through a pipeline, have all the applications put on it, deploy it out, and ensure that that particular configuration is going to remain intact. And they can give their users the freedom to install whatever they like to, just depending on their security policy.
Yeah, I like to say that our desktop offerings, for that matter, our security instances, are also doing what Agile's done for development and what DevOps has done for operations, is what we're trying to do in concept to bring security into this codified environment, and ultimately a DevSecOps situation, but also for desktop management. We're able to bring that streamlined and that automation through code. I think are key elements. And I think those resonate with our final thoughts here, that security and compliance requirements need to be as provided as code, because code is universal, code is standardized, code is extensible, so code is automatable and scalable too, right? Compliance as code needs to be directly put into this automated delivery process, and ultimately shifting left into development, but also shifting right into production. So you're able to not only anticipate early in the development process cycle, where you're able to have a secured final product, but you're also able to maintain that secure and compliant product after it is in production. So it's a shift both ways, right? Left and right in that overall instance. And Gartner, the final Gartner quote there, where they agree that compliance automation is essentially vital, as it removes manual execution step, it minimizes the potential for human error, and it enhances the consistency, traceability, and more importantly, the auditability of the entire process. I know we've answered a few questions. Now it's time for you to put into the any outstanding Q&A questions that you have, or in the chat if you want to have additional thoughts. Some final thoughts, Chris, and the next slide I have some resources for our viewers. So I'm going to put it up there so they can take note of that. But in the meantime, do you have any closing thoughts while we wait for any questions? If not, I have some questions for you, because I'll throw you a curveball anyway.
Yes, I had no doubt about that, Alan. Just my closing thoughts on it. What I see in the field, I love the findings that Gartner put in your last slide. But I would say more importantly, the ROI that the customers find in automating their security process, the return, and I spoke a little bit about this earlier in the presentation. I have customers, as an example, it took them 72 days to deploy a single server. It also cost them $66,000 in terms of the analysis on what it took in costs and expenses to actually get that server deployed. With automation, they were literally able to cut to a tenth of that price in terms of deployment, given their security circumstances. That the financial savings in terms of time spent, man hours, money involved, all of that was just ridiculously cut for them. And so at the end of the day, they couldn't really find a reason why they would not move into a more automated fashion of deploying security as code, and that was the big pillar for them. So if you're looking at doing a full analysis on what makes sense for your group, please feel free. I know that we have resources at Chef that can do that for you. But we're happy to answer any questions that you have. Let's see if Alan can stump me.
Yeah. Well, it's not stump, you know that, but one question I have is, what has been, from a field perspective, what has been the hardest challenge to overcome in terms of this compliance as code? Is it a concept that is foreign to people, or with DevSecOps and DevOps kind of mentality and pipeline delivery, is that more and more kind of commonplace? What are some of the challenges in overcoming those, those barriers to introducing this concept to organizations? Is because financial services seem to be a very conservative, I'll say, kind of institution. They're not looking for the cutting edge of anything in terms of delivery. So how is that introducing that concept of compliance as code to some very regulated, very regimented organizations?
Great question. And that kind of goes back to Craig's question, right? What are the difficulties in it? Why wouldn't people migrate, into this? What are the difficulties in it? From a financials perspective, as well as the federal government, they marry each other very closely. The attitude is, hey, why don't we wait? Not buy the first model year of that particular car. Let's wait and see and let the bugs be fixed, and then move into it when everybody else has tested it on their things. Insurance, healthcare, other verticals are a little bit more prone to get after, some of the newness, and the ability to implement, additional layers, and ensure that they're willing to take a little bit more risk in that fashion. But adding more layers in security is where every security person wants to be. The concept, going back to that, in moving this in, it really comes from two different groups, right? You've got your DevOps group who they just want to create code. They want to create new stuff and they want to get it into production and, beat their competition to market and show, all the creative, new hotness that they can bring to, their production lines. Building that security piece into it from a security standpoint, they're very traditional. You have an operation, we have a standard and it's easy and it makes it fast because we're always the ones who get blamed for slowing production down or slowing down time to market. So they're always looking for ways to increase that speed and the security. So the concept of bringing those two together, if anybody's ever brought, development and the security teams into the same room, they typically don't agree. Even operations, that third leg of that piece, they typically don't agree. But when they see the common language and their ability to be agile in the space and to come together and building out, hey, this is really the gold standard and we can do this at any facet and it's automated. I don't have to bother with it. I can build in signature authority, or I can put processes in where people can stop and check and ensure that things are being done properly without it getting into production. To have those assurances are all just coded right into it. And it really takes very little effort if you already have this stuff. So that's part of the things that you would need to think about. I would recommend sponsorship if you're looking at doing something like this. Work with these three legs in this pillar and have them understand what it is you're trying to accomplish and show them the actual hard data. Get their sponsorship before you try to move into moving to your leadership and saying, hey, this is the way we need to change the op and this is what makes sense for us long term, because the immediate investment in it has to be there in order to get it to come off properly. And that may take some staff aug. It may take getting services involved. It may take re-looking at the operation in its entirety and understanding where you can make those efficiencies. Those are the bigger problems that they face.
Great. Yeah, there's some more specific questions. I think we won't have time to address those, but in general, next steps, if you want a copy of that Gartner report, that last link there, chef.io/DevSecOps, has the registration page, and you can download that report directly there. Chris, I think you can address the specific questions that some of this is out there. But before we close, I think Aaron has some closing words.
All right, yeah. I mean, we can close it out there. I'm not sure if you want to answer those last few questions there.
Chris,
we definitely have time.
Take them?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, I was trying to send some of these out. What, if anything, do you lose if you don't use the Chef Infra client to run inspect scans via the audit cookbook? If you simply use WinRM or SHA? I answered that in one question, but yeah, there's two methodologies that you can do this. You can either scan from the outside as long as you have access, which is easy. You don't have to install the client at all. Or you can put the client on. Obviously, it just depends on how your security configuration is set up, on what the best method is for you. We're completely flexible and agile in that aspect. Like I said a little bit earlier, you can build, if you already have some other tools in place, you can build certain things into the product in terms of access. If you've got, say, some type of SIM employed and you want to pipe information into the SIM, if you've got, let's say, ServiceNow integrated into, and you're reporting back on configurations that way, that can be implemented as well. So it just kind of depends on the configuration. We're happy to evaluate those things and get involved. It's not a big deal. Just talk to your local chef dealer. So do we need to modify the CIS profiles to align with PCI DSS standards? You do not. In fact, you don't have to modify them. We pull down directly from CIS. We are certified by CIS with the templates that they push down. They don't have to be modified at all unless your policy doesn't want it. What's really cool about our product is that we have built-in waivers. So let's say you pull down a profile that you don't need to scan certain areas of your fleet with those particular checks. You can waive those as you need to with certain areas. And you can build them up, you can modify them, you can change them however you like, but you get the template, it downloads right into the system. You can deploy it and do a scan and get a report back, and literally within hours. And you don't have to do that full setup in terms of that. But the bigger strategic picture, if you're looking at long-term stuff and really having an impact on what you're doing, you really should take it in phases. First do the deployment, get used to the tool, and then understand how it would build into an operation depending on what your operation is doing. You can build it into your CI/CD. You can build a test kitchen in there, and it works pretty flawlessly. We've been doing this for quite a long time. Founders in DevOps for sure, but this is a real game changer for Chef and Progress, and happy to help with anyone who needs it.
Great. Yes, and I want to thank you all for attending, for spending this hour with us. Time flies when we're having fun. So thanks, Chris, for being here and helping answer some of these questions. If you're watching this and you think it's of value, please make sure to share it with your colleagues within your organization, and let's make sure we have the ability to advocate for compliance as code out there in the marketplace. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy your day.
Thanks, everyone.